Okay, let's unpack this. Prepare for maybe a bit of a wild ride here. Could the absolute horror of 9/11 have, indirectly paved the way for 50 Shades of Grey bringing BDSM into the mainstream?
It sounds, yeah, totally improbable on the surface.
Right.
But the material we're looking at, it traces this really fascinating, kind of unexpected cultural ripple. So the mission for this deep dive is really to explore exactly that.
Okay.
How could this massive tragedy have possibly, indirectly, helped bring BDSM into mainstream discussion? We're basing this on the connections laid out in our sources.
Right. So we're following the specific chain. Gerard Way, witnessing 9/11, that leading him to start My Chemical Romance. Their whole vibe influencing Stephenie Meyer in Twilight, and then that whole phenomenon inspiring E.L. James to write 50 Shades.
Exactly. And to really get the significance of 50 Shades for the kink community itself, we need to talk about Susan Wright and the National Coalition for Sexual Freedom, the NCSF.
Okay, yeah.
She founded it back in, 1997? So NCSF was already advocating for alternative sexual expression, long before 50 Shades was even a thing.
Right.
They were established.
Yeah. And Wright was also really involved in the DSM-5 revision project. That's super important because it led to consensual BDSM being depathologized in 2013.
Meaning it was taken off the list of mental disorders.
Precisely. A huge shift. So Susan Wright, she gives us this vital perspective, right, on what the kink world looked like before 50 Shades and then after.
Definitely. The source even quotes her, calling its publication a kind of a turning point, a Stonewall moment for kink.
Wow. Okay. Stonewall moment. That's strong.
It is. And her long history there, it just gives invaluable insight into how things shifted and the surprising role these seemingly totally separate events might have played.
Okay. So we have this domino effect, this unlikely sequence. But what was the actual impact? When 50 Shades hit, what did that mainstream spotlight really do to the kink community and how people saw it?
Well, one big thing the source points to is how it sparked much wider conversations about consent.
Even though the book itself got a lot of criticism on that front.
Exactly. Even the debates, the arguments about the relationship portrayal in 50 Shades, whether they were accurate or healthy. Just having those debates pushed society, to grapple with consent, power dynamics, what healthy relationships look like.
It's almost paradoxical, isn't it? That even negative or critical attention ended up forcing more discussion.
Yeah. And Wright suggests these conversations, this general raising of awareness around consent, might have actually helped create the sort of climate where the Me Too movement later gained so much traction.
That's a fascinating link.
It really shows how interconnected these cultural moments can be, right? The mainstream attention, maybe not always perfectly informed, but it opened a door for more serious talks about consent, about accountability, both, in the wider world and within the kink community itself.
And the internet played a big role here too, didn't it? Wright mentions kink folks being early adopters online.
Oh, definitely. And what's really notable is how the internet created these absolutely vital spaces, for connection, for community, especially for a group that often faced and still faces a lot of stigma.
So before 50 Shades made it also visible.
Right. Before that, online forums, even older things like group phone lines, discreet personal ads, those were essential for people finding each other, building that sense of community. The internet just amplified that massively.
And the source notes the actual term BDSM came from an early online bondage group.
Yeah. Which is a great example of the community kind of shaping its own identity, its own language online, way before the mainstream was paying much attention.
And then after 50 Shades, did that change the online scene?
Well, it led to another huge surge, apparently. Platforms like FetLife saw massive growth, which meant even more access to peer support, information, especially for people who maybe weren't ready or able to go to in-person events.
But it wasn't all smooth sailing with this new visibility, was it? The source mentions some tensions.
Right, and that brings up a good question. What happens when something that was on the fringes, kind of hidden, moves closer to the mainstream?
Does it lose something? Does it gain something?
Exactly. And Susan Wright offers a really interesting take here. While some people might feel nostalgic for the secrecy of the past, she argues that the increased openness has actually brought really significant benefits overall.
How so?
She points out that back then there were just fewer resources, fewer safe ways to connect, and the stigma was much, much higher. So that kind of romanticized idea of a secret club maybe doesn't reflect the reality for a lot of people back then.
Yeah, that makes sense if you felt totally isolated.
Precisely. The source mentions a high percentage of people kept their involvement secret, sometimes even from their partners. That just shows how damaging that stigma was and still can be.
And this ties into the legal stuff, right? Decriminalization. That's a big focus for Wright and NCSF.
Absolutely critical, because, as Wright points out, BDSM practices are often still considered criminal behavior under existing case law in many places. And that has serious, serious consequences.
Like what?
Well, think about it. If the activity itself is seen as potentially criminal, it creates this huge barrier for people within the kink community who actually experience harm, like assault.
Ah, okay.
The rough sex defense example she gives is, well, it's deeply disturbing. It shows how a lack of legal clarity and understanding can be twisted and exploited when someone is actually assaulted.
So the victim might be blamed, or the perpetrator claims it was consensual BDSM gone wrong?
Exactly. It muddies the waters legally in a really dangerous way.
And this legal gray area, it also stops public health groups from creating guidelines for safer practices.
That's another key point, yeah.
Yeah.
Because how can they advise on something that's technically illegal in some contexts?
So decriminalization isn't about, like, promoting BDSM.
Not at all. It's about acknowledging reality. It's about creating a framework for safety, for education, for consent, and for accountability when things do go wrong.
Okay, let's circle back to Susan Wright and the DSM-5. You said that was a really pivotal moment, depathologization.
Yeah, it really was. And what's important is how it happened. It wasn't just, a decision made in a vacuum, right? And the NCSF gathered a lot of evidence.
Like what kind of evidence?
Data, yes, but also incredibly powerful personal stories, particularly from parents who were facing custody battles, losing or potentially losing their kids, simply because they had diagnoses related to sadism or masochism, even when everything was consensual.
Wow. Just imagine that. Your consensual sexual preferences being used to argue you're an unfit parent.
It's devastating.
Yeah.
And it highlights the very real-world harm these diagnostic labels can cause when misapplied or misunderstood.
So Wright took these stories directly to the people working on the DSM.
Yes, she communicated directly with Dr. Kruger, who was leading that section, really emphasizing the damage being done to families. It helped draw a crucial distinction. Between community members, people involved in consensual kink networks, who are generally mentally healthy, prioritize consent, understand risks and forensic populations. Yeah, individuals who have actually committed non-consensual acts, they're very different groups.
And making that distinction clear was key to the DSM change.
Absolutely. And the proof is kind of in the pudding, right? After the DSM changed in 2013, the number of custody cases involving these issues reported to NCSF dropped significantly.
Yeah, that's a tangible result. Shows how important getting those definitions right really is.
Hugely important. It shows why these diagnostic manuals need to reflect reality accurately and, frankly, avoid causing unnecessary harm.
So given all this history, the stigma, the changes, what does this mean for therapists today? If a client comes in and discloses they're involved in kink, Susan Wright had some specific advice there.
Yeah, and this is really crucial for mental health professionals. Wright is very clear about the potential damage, the harm, that happens when a therapist reacts with judgment or shock or shame when a client discloses this part of their life.
It could shut the client down completely.
Or worse, traumatize them. It stops people from getting the support they might actually need, maybe for totally unrelated issues, because they fear that judgment about their sexuality.
So her advice is basically, get educated.
Pretty much. Educate yourselves. Use the resources out there like the kink clinical guidelines she mentioned. And fundamentally, just don't stigmatize your clients' consensual sexual preferences.
It's about neutrality, professionalism.
Exactly. Therapists aren't being asked to, endorse BDSM or participate or anything like that.
Of course not.
It's about understanding, supporting the client as a whole person, and not letting your own biases or discomfort get in the way. And look, if a therapist truly feels they can't be unbiased, referral is always an option.
Right. Refer to someone who is knowledgeable and comfortable.
Yes. But actively shaming or stigmatizing a client, that's just never okay. It violates the core ethics of therapy.
Okay, so let's try and tie this all together. It's been a fascinating, if maybe slightly dizzying journey.
Definitely a winding path.
From a global tragedy, 9/11, through rock music, vampire novels, to a book that brought BDSM crashing into the mainstream conversation.
Yeah, this seemingly improbable chain of events really does highlight how interconnected culture is, how things you'd never think are related can actually influence each other in really profound, unforeseen ways, affecting social norms, individual lives.
And Susan Wright's perspective throughout this has been so illuminating, hasn't it? Showing that evolution from the the much more hidden early days.
The pre-internet, pre-50 Shades era.
To the explosion of visibility afterward, but also highlighting the challenges that still exist. It's not like everything is solved.
Not at all. And her point about kink potentially being an identity for some people, not just a behavior, that's important too.
Right.
And linking that back to the internet, how vital it was for building that early community when stigma was so high. It adds another layer. Those early online platforms were lifelines.
It's also important, though, to circle back to the positive impacts you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
Especially around consent conversations.
Yes, absolutely. Wright's view is that even the controversy around 50 Shades helped push consent into the spotlight, maybe even contributing, like we said, to the climate for Me Too.
But the hurdles are still there.
Big ones. Especially the legal side, the criminalization issue, the impact that has on people seeking justice if they are harmed within the community. That rough sex defense is a really stark reminder of the legal messiness that still needs fixing.
And her work on the DSM-5 changes, getting sadism and masochism depathologized. It shows the power of data, yes, but also the power of community voices, of personal stories, and challenging those deep-seated misconceptions.
Definitely.
And finally, that advice for therapists, it feels like such a crucial piece of this. The need for education, for a non-judgmental approach.
Yeah, understanding the real harm that stigma can do, especially within what should be a safe therapeutic space.
So when you step back and look at this whole complex journey we've traced, it really makes you think, doesn't it? How do these completely disparate events, things that seem worlds apart, end up shaping huge cultural shifts?
Yeah.
And changing how we understand ourselves, our identities, our sexualities in ways nobody could ever have predicted.
It really does.
It just underscores the power of those unexpected connections, I suppose, and how societal norms around these things are, well, constantly evolving, still very much in flux.